Thank you for downloading from Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. Support for this podcast comes from your generous gifts and donations. You can find out more about Ravi Zacharias and the team at www.rzim.org.
The loss of wonder ends up with the loss of gratitude because autonomy reigns supreme and we become completely autonomous to ourselves. You can be in the Middle East, you can be in the Far East, you can be in the Orient, where there are hundreds of millions of people, whether rightly or wrongly, please hear me, whether rightly or wrongly, hundreds of millions of people who in some form of religious expression signal a sense of gratitude to a higher power. Hundreds of millions of them, in some form of gratitude, signal an indebtedness and a gratitude to a higher power.
Welcome back to Just Thinking with Ravi Zacharias. Wonder is an important part of understanding who we are and our relationship to a sovereign God. Our series this week is titled, In Search of Meaning. Yesterday, Ravi shared how wonder brings meaning because an enormous sense of awe is indispensable in life. But what happens when that wonder is lost? That's where we begin today as Ravi continues part 2 of his message. Here's Ravi.
I believe firmly that when wonder has been lost, 3 things happen. Number 1, there is an inevitable reductionism that takes place. It all ultimately becomes glandular or matter, and it never can rise to the dignity that some of our lives can and ought to rise to. What Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said in his Nobel Prize-winning speech, the eternal oughtness that forever confronts us. We are not mere flotsam and jetsam in a river of life. But when wonder is lost, reductionism takes its toll. God is like the sun. You cannot look at it, but without it you can't look at anything else. So the loss of wonder ends up in a reductionistic worldview. The loss of wonder ends up with the loss of gratitude because autonomy reigns supreme and we become completely autonomous to ourselves. You can be in the Middle East, you can be in the Far East, you can be in the Orient, where there are hundreds of millions of people, whether rightly or wrongly, please hear me, whether rightly or wrongly, hundreds of millions of people who in some form of religious expression signal a sense of gratitude to a higher power. Hundreds of millions of them, in some form of gratitude, signal an indebtedness and a gratitude to a higher power. We are living dangerously in North America, assuming that by our power and by our will and by our knowledge and by our progress, we don't need to be thankful to anyone anymore. We have pulled ourselves by our technological and economic and intellectual bootstraps. And Arnold Toynbee may well be right. We'll be the first of 21 civilizations daring this kind of an experiment. Some time ago, an Air Canada jet took off. I think it had taken off somewhere in the United States and was heading to Ottawa in Canada. At about 10 or 15,000 feet, I don't know how high it was, there was a fire in the washroom of that aircraft. And the pilot was told that a fire had begun there, and immediately he knew there would be very little time left to make his emergency landing. He plummeted. I think it was at Cincinnati, he made an emergency landing. And he hit that runway so hard that the wheels of that plane broke. And if I recall, even the very body of that plane began to break apart as he'd landed. But as the doors were open and the oxygen was just sucked in and the flames were turning it into an uncontrollable blaze, bodies were coming out of the emergency exits, charred and being thrown out, some of them. Many people died. And the last person to leave the aircraft was the pilot himself with his uniform ablaze. And as he walked out and the flames had to be doused out, he avoided all press reporters, went alone into his own room there to mourn the tragedy of what he had witnessed. Let me ask you something. Isn't it true that if one of your loved ones had been rescued, you'd want to go and grab that man by the hand and say, "Sir, thank you for what you've done for me, for my family, for my loved ones." Or even if you'd lost one, "Thank you for trying to save the lives of my family. You were truly the captain of your ship till the very last moment when your own life was in jeopardy there." Wouldn't you want to reach out to that hand and say thank you? Because it's natural. But move over a few days later to an Eastern Airlines aircraft which took off, I think, somewhere from Atlanta. And as it was making its way to the Caribbean, lost power. First in one engine, then in two. I don't know how many engines were there on that aircraft. All power was lost. And the recording says the pilot's voice came over the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, we've lost all power. Ditching is inevitable. Ditching is inevitable. The trembling voice. Suddenly and strangely and unexplainably, one engine started. He was able to limp it up and able to bring it back as he testified to landing. Whom do you thank then? May I suggest that if your children and mine wake up on Christmas morning and have somebody to thank for putting candy into their stockings, have you and I got nobody to thank for putting 2 feet into ours? The whole idea of gratitude, may I suggest to you, is indispensable for existence. Reductionism takes place with the loss of wonder, gratitude is lost, and thirdly and most importantly, we move now into the adult world in the frame of reference. When that sense of enchantment and wonder is lost, then a sense of emptiness begins to dawn, because wonder no longer holds the attention of the mind. Nobody said it better than Albert Camus, the existentialist philosopher. And Albert Camus has a short story that he calls The Adulterous Woman, about a couple living in a village that were going to visit a certain city. This was the first visit she was paying into the city. He was a businessman. He brought her in to enjoy the lights of the city, the fun of the city. And as he went away to do his business for the day, he left her. She looked across the street and saw all of the men walking hither and yon, going about their business, and began to live a teenage dream that Camus tells us she'd once had. He is not specific, you could imagine. All we are reminded was it was a lustful dream. And she thinks this is her only opportunity. She may never have it again. But Camus carries on that she is afraid that if she crosses this line and her husband finds out, there may be violence in the home. So she's so ambivalent, doesn't make the decision. He comes back in the evening, sees her, takes her out for dinner. They check into a hotel for the night as planned. They get into bed. He puts his head on the pillow. He's soundly asleep. And all of a sudden she finds herself, while her husband beside her is sound asleep, thinking what an opportunity she had. She would never have it again. And on that pillow, she's thinking about this. And she decides she can slip out into the night, enjoy the lust of the night, and return. She gets changed, goes out, enjoys the lust of the night, comes back, rechange into her night clothes, slips under the covers. Now that head is on the pillow and it can't sleep. As tears begin to fill and then roll down the side of her face, and as she begins to cry louder and louder, trying to restrain those sobs, she sits up in bed with her face in her hands, controlling those sobs, and her husband sits up and says, "What's the matter?" And in typical atheistic existential anticlimax, the short story ends with these words of her to him. As he said to her, "What's the matter?" she pushes him away and says, "Nothing, just nothing." And I add this: the loneliest moment in life is when you have just experienced that which you thought would deliver the ultimate, and it has let you down. And we are got a whole generation of young people around our country today empty, because they're moving from enchantment to enchantment to enchantment. And as it betrays them one after another, that loneliness stalks them like a ghost that just won't go away. And why is that? May I suggest to you, because I think the progression from childhood to those teenage and younger years is very logical. Go back and see how it fits. If you were to take 3 children, say I took 3 of mine at the age of 5, at the age of 6, at the age of 3, and at the age of 1, or something like that, and I took the oldest one and told her a fairy story, it would not enthrall her anymore. But if I did something like this, I said, "Sarah, little Tommy got up and walked up to the door, and Tommy opened the door, and a dragon jumped in front of Tommy. When the dragon jumps in front of Tommy, Sarah's eyes get wide." But now I go to the 3-year-old, Naomi, and I say, "Nimmy, listen to this story." And I take her through it and then say, "Little Tommy got up and walked up to the door, and little Tommy opened the door. Nimmy's eyes get wide." And I look at Nathan at age 1, when his whole worldview is exhausted in one word, cookie. And I say, Nathan, little Tommy got up and walked up to the door. Nathan's eyes get wide. What's the difference? For Sarah, you needed the dragon. For Naomi, you needed the open door. For little Nate, it was a pretty big deal at age 1 just to walk up to the door. The older you get, the more it takes to fill your heart with wonder, and only God is big enough to fill it. Nietzsche said he took a lantern and went searching and couldn't find God. David said, "Whither shall I flee from thy presence?" He said, "Wherever I make my bed, lo, thou art there." How does the Christian deal with this sense of wonder? May I suggest to you, dear friend, it's not merely in propositions, it's not merely in dogma, it's not certainly in doctrines, and unfortunately the history of the church has not been too noble a one either in many of the wrong-headed directions in which the church often moved. The centerpiece of the answer is in the person of Jesus Christ, so much so that even Lecky, the famed historian, who was a secular writer, said nobody in the historical landscape has ever had such a moral influence on mankind as the person of Jesus Christ. And I say to you what the famous Scottish divine James Stewart said in looking at Christ, a picture we don't often get. We think of him in so many weak terms and so many meek terms, almost like a figment of imagination concocted by somebody else. Listen to what Stewart talks about in the person of Christ as the startling coalescence of contrarieties. He says this: he was the meekest and lowliest of all the sons of men, yet he spoke of coming on the clouds of heaven with the glory of God. He was so austere that evil spirits and demons cried out in terror at his coming, yet he was so genial and winsome and approachable that the children loved to play with him and the little ones nestled in his arms. His presence at the innocent gaiety of a village wedding was like the presence of sunshine. No one was half so compassionate to sinners, yet no one ever spoke such red-hot scorching words about sin. A bruised reed he would not break. His whole life was love, yet on one occasion he demanded of the Pharisees how they ever expected to escape the damnation of hell. He was a dreamer of dreams and a seer of visions, yet for sheer stark realism he has all of our self-styled realists soundly beaten. He was a servant of all, washing the disciples' feet, yet masterfully he strode into the temple, and the hucksters and money changers fell over one another to get away from the mad rush and the fire they saw blazing in his eyes. He saved others, yet at the last himself he did not save. There is nothing in history like the union of contrasts which confronts us in the Gospels. The mystery of Jesus, says James Stewart, is the mystery of divine personality.
Do you experience the wonder that Ravi mentioned as intrinsic to a meaningful life? If you have any doubt, you might be interested in ordering a copy of this message, along with 2 other lectures in a series titled Ohio State University Veritas Forum. The full set includes the Q&A session that followed Ravi's presentation and a recorded interview from a radio call-in program with Ravi and astrophysicist Hugh Ross. To order your copy of this resource, call us at 1-800-448-6766 and ask for the title, The Ohio State University Veritas Forum.
To find out more about the ministry of RZIM or how you can partner with us, be sure to call us. Or you can visit our website at rzim.org or rzim.ca for those in Canada. Your prayers and financial support allow us to encourage and equip Christians and to share the gospel with gentleness and respect. Just Thinking is a listener-supported radio ministry and is furnished by Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, Atlanta, Georgia.